The form was 11 pages long. Daniel Reyes had filled out 11-page forms before. He'd filled them out for his wife's third surgery, and then her fourth, and then the one the oncologist called a procedural intervention, because nobody had the stomach anymore to call it by its actual name. He knew the particular texture of bureaucratic paper in fluorescent light, the way a ballpoint pen skips on the glossy insurance sections, the way your hand cramps around the third page and keeps cramping until the end. He was not afraid of 11-page forms. Mr. Reyes. The administrator had a name badge that said PATRICIA and a tone that said she had been waiting for someone to say no for a long time and was genuinely delighted to have found her candidate. I want to be very clear about what you're signing. I can read. The liability alone. Patricia. He said her name the way you say a word that has lost its meaning from overuse. I understand the liability. I'm signing it. She slid the form back across the desk, a little harder than necessary. Daniel picked up the pen. Outside the administrator's window, the quarantine wing of Hargrove Memorial Hospital sat in the particular stillness of a place where people had agreed, by unspoken consensus, not to look directly at what was happening. The hallway beyond the glass was empty except for a single security officer who had found something extremely interesting to study on his phone. The nurse's station was fully staffed, and every nurse was facing the other direction. The chief of medicine, Dr. Anand Patel, had sent 3 emails in the past hour explaining, in escalating bureaucratic language, why the situation had no good solution, why the federal guidelines were ambiguous, why the interplanetary non-interference protocols created a genuine legal gray area, and why, ultimately, the hospital could not be held responsible for outcomes in cases with no medical precedent. Daniel signed page 1. He had been a social worker for 22 years. Before that, he had been a boy who watched his grandmother navigate an American hospital with no English and a blood pressure cuff she didn't understand, and a nurse who spoke to her very slowly and very loudly as though volume were a form of translation. He had decided then, with the absolute certainty that only children and saints possess, that he would spend his life in the space between people who needed help and systems that were too big to care. He had mostly succeeded. He had also mostly failed, in the way that all people who work in that space eventually fail, not catastrophically, but incrementally, one case at a time, learning the exact weight of what was possible and what wasn't, carrying that weight home every night and setting it by the door and picking it up again in the morning. His wife had called it his God complex. She'd said it with love. She'd said it on the last night she was lucid enough to say anything complicated, and he had laughed and she had laughed, and it had been the last time they laughed together, which neither of them knew yet. Page 2, the section about pre-existing conditions. Daniel wrote NA in every box because he had been told by the xenobiological liaison officer, a 26-year-old from Johns Hopkins, who had been on the job for 3 weeks and looked like she was going to be sick, that they genuinely did not know what a pre-existing condition would look like for a species that had no medical file on Earth, no prior contact with Earth's medical infrastructure, and no means of communicating what was wrong with her beyond the bioluminescent patterns fading along her skin, like a light being slowly turned down. He had asked the liaison officer her name, Yolanda. He had asked Yolanda if she had eaten anything today. She had not. He had found her a granola bar from his bag and told her to go sit down somewhere that wasn't in front of the intake glass, because the intake glass faced the bed where the alien girl lay, and the alien girl's light was doing something that Yolanda described, in a voice that cracked once and then steadied, as the equivalent of a flatline in a language we can't read yet. Page 3. Here was what Daniel knew about the alien girl, which was almost nothing. She had been found 6 days ago in the parking structure of a Costco in Tempe, Arizona, by a woman named Rosa Gutierrez, who was loading a 12-pack of paper towels into her SUV. Rosa Gutierrez had not panicked. Rosa had called 911, covered the alien girl with a Mylar emergency blanket she kept in her emergency kit because she lived in a state with a lot of summer heat, and sat next to the girl talking quietly about nothing: the weather, her daughter's swim meet, the rising cost of gas, until the paramedics arrived 11 minutes later. Rosa Gutierrez was, in Daniel's professional opinion, a hero, and also the only person in this entire sequence of events who had done the obvious correct thing without being asked. The paramedics had brought her here. The federal protocols had kicked in immediately, all 47 pages of them, written in the post-contact years when the arrival of the Veth had seemed like something that could be managed with enough policy documents. The Veth were 7 feet tall, iridescent, and breathed a mixture of gases that required pressurized suits for any human who entered their space. They communicated through bioluminescent pulses along their outer membrane, a full language, Yolanda had explained, with syntax and tonal registers and something analogous to metaphor, running in the visible light spectrum between deep blue and amber. They had arrived 9 years ago, established diplomatic contact with 14 governments, shared 3 pieces of technology that had rewritten human medicine, and mostly kept to themselves in a way that the press had spent 9 years calling mysterious and the actual xenobiologists called, more accurately, politely uninterested. No one had seen a Veth child before. The girl, they called her a girl because she was small, because she was alone, because calling her a child was the only framework that made any emotional sense, was approximately the size of a 12-year-old human. Her membrane was pale where the others were vivid, and her light, which had been a faint but present blue on arrival, had been fading for 4 days. The Veth embassy had been contacted. The Veth embassy had issued a statement through their diplomatic translator that consisted in its entirety of 3 words: acknowledgement, patience, protocol. Nobody knew what that meant. The xenolinguists had been arguing about it for 4 days. Dr. Patel had concluded, in his 3rd email, that, given the diplomatic sensitivity, the ambiguity of established interplanetary protocols, and the absence of verified next-of-kin or guardian documentation, the hospital's legal standing with respect to direct medical intervention is unclear at best and potentially in violation of the non-interference compact at worst. Daniel had read that email at 6 a.m., standing in his kitchen, and had thought about his wife, and had thought about his grandmother, and had thought about Rosa Gutierrez sitting next to a stranger in a parking structure, talking about nothing, covering her with silver foil against the heat. He had driven to the hospital and asked to speak to Patricia. Page 4, emergency contact. He wrote his own name, because there was no one else to write, because the girl was alone the way people are alone when every system that should notice them has decided, for administrative reasons, not to look. You understand, Patricia said, not looking up from her terminal, that if she dies, this form will be reviewed by 4 federal agencies. I understand. And if she survives, the liability questions will be. Patricia, he looked at her until she looked at him. Has anyone been in that room with her? A pause. The exposure protocols. Has anyone been in that room with her in 6 days? The pause was longer this time. The xenobiological liaison has been observing through the glass, Patricia said finally. And the night nurse checks the atmospheric monitors every 3 hours. Daniel nodded once. He signed page 4. He had read everything available about the Veth in the past 6 days, which was not much, because the Veth were careful about what they shared. But Yolanda had given him access to the xenobiological field notes, which included thermal imaging data and behavioral observation logs from the 3 Veth diplomatic compound visits that human researchers had been permitted to attend. What the notes described, in the careful language of people trying to be precise about something they didn't fully understand, was a species that did not handle isolation well. Not in the human sense of loneliness, something more physical than that, more fundamental. The Veth membrane, Yolanda had explained, was both a language organ and a sensory organ. It read the light of other Veth the way skin reads temperature. Prolonged deprivation of that input had observable physiological effects. She had been alone for 6 days. Her light had been fading for 4. The xenolinguist's best interpretation of acknowledgement, patience, protocol, was that the Veth embassy was aware of the situation and was following their own internal procedures before intervening. The second best interpretation was that it was a form of condolence. The worst interpretation, which nobody said out loud, was that it meant, "This is not our problem to solve." Page 5, Medical History. Daniel wrote, carefully, everything Yolanda had told him about the species and left every other box blank, because blanks were honest and invented information was not, and he had never once in 22 years written something on a form that he did not know to be true. His wife had told him in the hospital during the 3rd surgery that he loved paperwork the way other people loved rituals, that he found something genuinely stabilizing in the act of committing things to paper, of making the uncertain official, of putting a signature under a truth. She had been sedated and talking more freely than usual, and she had said, with great tenderness, "You think if you sign it, it becomes real. You think if you refuse to sign it, you can unreal it." She had not been wrong about either thing. He signed page 5. Through the window, the quarantine wing was still empty. The security officer had found a new thing to look at on his phone. Somewhere down the hall, Yolanda would be sitting with her granola bar, facing away from the intake glass, which was the correct thing to do if you wanted to not feel what you would feel if you looked, and the completely wrong thing to do if you were the only other living being in this hospital who understood even approximately what was happening to the girl on the other side. Page 6 asked about insurance. Daniel wrote the hospital's own billing code in the insurance field, because he had learned over 22 years that billing codes were a language, and the language had dialects, and one of the dialects was, "This is the administration's problem now." He had no legal authority to do this. He had done it 17 times in 22 years, always for patients who had no one, always in situations where the alternative was a different kind of paperwork, the kind filled out after rather than before. He had been formally reprimanded for it twice. He had kept doing it. He signed page 6. The Veth compound in Phoenix was 40 minutes from this hospital. He knew this because he had looked it up at 5 a.m., lying in the house that still had his wife's reading glasses on the nightstand, because he had not been able to put them anywhere else. He had also looked up whether the non-interference compact had any explicit provision regarding emergency medical situations involving minors, and found that it did not, because the compact had been written in the first years of contact when the existence of Veth children had not yet been established as a fact, which was the kind of thing that seemed obvious in retrospect and disastrous in the present. Page 7, Patient Identification. He wrote what Yolanda had told him, unknown juvenile Veth found Tempe AZ, date of discovery. In the name field after a moment he wrote, Jane. He had not planned to do that. He sat with it for a second and then left it, because she needed a name that the nurses could use, and also because she was alone in there, and he wanted her to have something. Page 8 was the one about financial guarantor. He wrote his own name in the guarantor field, and his home address and his bank account number, and acknowledged by his signature that he was personally liable for any and all costs incurred in the treatment and care of the above-named patient. Patricia looked up from her terminal. Mr. Reyes. "I know," he said. "The costs could be." "I know." He signed page 8. After Margaret died, he had spent a lot of time trying to figure out what to do with the money that had been meant for the things they were going to do. The trip to Portugal, the kitchen renovation, the thing where they were going to buy a sailboat even though neither of them could sail, which had been Margaret's idea and had been, from the beginning, less about sailing than about having something to plan. He had mostly just left the money in the account. He didn't need it for anything that felt real. He needed it for this. Page 9. Consent to treatment. He read every clause. This was the one Patricia had been most worried about, the one that the hospital's legal team had apparently spent 2 days arguing over, the one with the sub-clauses about unprecedented physiological contexts and the limits of standard medical protocols, and the acknowledgement that treatment might involve modalities outside established human medical practice. He read it the way he read all important documents, from beginning to end, without skipping, noting the places where the language became deliberately vague and the places where it became deliberately precise, understanding that both kinds of language were trying to tell you something. What it was trying to tell him was that they didn't know how to help her and they were afraid to try, and they would try anyway if someone signed their name to the possibility. He signed page 9. And then something happened. He heard it before he processed it, a sound from the quarantine wing through the sealed observation window, faint enough that he told himself he'd imagined it. Then it came again. Not a cry, not a word in any language he knew. A tone, low and wavering, the kind of sound that is not made with a mouth but with something deeper, something that the body makes when the part of it that holds light is trying to say something that light cannot reach. He looked up. The girl Jane had turned her head. She was looking at the window. She was looking directly at the window, or rather at the shape behind the window, which was him, and her membrane, which had been a flat and fading gray for 4 days according to Yolanda's hourly logs, was doing something. Not bright, not healthy, but something. A pulse. Blue-white, there and gone, slow and irregular, like the last station on a long drive that keeps cutting in and out of static. He didn't know what it meant. He didn't need to know what it meant. He picked up the pen and signed pages 10 and 11 without reading them, which was the only time in 22 years he had signed anything without reading it, and he thought Margaret would have laughed at that, would have said finally, would have said the God complex has limits after all, and he thought she would have been wrong, because this wasn't faith and it wasn't certainty. It was something simpler and older than either. It was just the refusal to look away. He put the pen down and stood up. "I need access to the quarantine wing," he said. Patricia stared at him. "The liability is signed, all 11 pages, Patricia." He looked at her the same way he'd looked at her before, the way that was not unkind, that was simply clear. "I need access to the wing." She looked at the form. She looked at the window. She looked at the girl Jane, still watching, still pulsing that faint blue-white, still trying to say something in a language that nobody in this building could read. Patricia picked up her phone and called security. The security officer, who had been looking at his phone, answered on the first ring. "I need you to escort a Mr. Reyes to the quarantine wing intake station," Patricia said. She was not looking at Daniel when she said it. She was looking at the window. Her voice was absolutely steady. "Full hazmat protocol." The intake station for the quarantine wing smelled like recycled air and disinfectant, and beneath that, something Daniel couldn't name, organic, faint, not unpleasant, like ozone before a storm but warmer. The hazmat suit was uncomfortable in the way that all protective gear is uncomfortable, designed for function and not for the person inside it, and Daniel had been in enough ICUs and isolation wards to know how to move in it without fighting it. Yolanda was waiting at the airlock. She had eaten the granola bar. Her hands were steady. "The atmospheric monitors show the nitrogen-helium mix is stable," she said. "We adjusted it 6 hours ago based on the compound data. It's an approximation, not a guarantee. The suit's filters should protect you against any differential exposure. Her temperature has been..." She stopped. She started again. "Her temperature has been dropping, about 0.5 degree every 12 hours for 3 days. I don't know if that's clinically significant for her species. I don't know what clinically significant looks like for her species." "What does it look like when they're healthy?" Daniel asked. "Bright," Yolanda said. "The field logs describe the membrane as they use words like luminous, vivid, dynamic, multiple colors, shifting registers, like watching a language think." She looked at the airlock door. "She looks like a lamp that's running out of power." "What would help her, best guess?" Yolanda hesitated. Yolanda was a scientist, and scientists hesitated when they were about to say something that outpaced their data. He waited. He had learned, in 22 years, that the pause before someone says the true thing is almost always longer than people expect. "Contact," she said finally. "Light-based input. The membrane's both a receiver and a transmitter. It needs something to respond to. If I'm right, if the social physiology works the way I think it does, then 6 days alone in a gray room with no light signal and no other veth." She trailed off. "I might be completely wrong. I have 3 weeks of field notes and 1 semester of xenobiology and a really good textbook." "What does the textbook say?" "It says veth juveniles separated from their cohort display progressive membrane suppression that reverses upon reintegration." She said it fast, the way people say things they've been repeating to themselves like a lifeline. "It says the reversal can happen even with non-veth light sources, that they can receive input from any bioluminescent source, or even, and this is the part where the textbook gets speculative, from high-intensity artificial light in the right spectrum. That they're not as narrow as we thought." Daniel looked through the small observation window in the airlock door. Jane was still turned toward the outer window, still pulsing, slower now. The pulse was maybe once every 4 seconds, he counted. "What spectrum?" he asked. Yolanda reached into her bag and pulled out a flashlight. It was not a standard flashlight. It was the kind of thing a scientist who had been lying awake for 3 weeks thinking about this would build. A flashlight with a spectrum filter, blue-white, variable intensity. "I can't go in there," Yolanda said. She said it without shame. "I've been trying for 3 days to get authorization to go in there, and I am 26 years old, and the hospital's legal team keeps telling me that as an affiliated observer I don't have independent medical standing, and if I enter without that standing and her voice broke and healed in the same breath. "I can't be the reason she doesn't get help. I can't have my access revoked before anyone finds something that actually works." Daniel looked at the flashlight. He thought about the overview effect. He had read about it in one of the 37 articles he'd consumed at 3 a.m. over the past week, preparing himself for a conversation with hospital administrators that nobody had asked him to have. The overview effect. The thing that happened when you looked down at the earth from far enough away in your brain, which had been sorting the world into categories since you were born, simply could not maintain those categories anymore. Not political categories, not national categories, not the categories of us and them and mine and yours. The astronauts who described it used words like dissolution, like unity, like the sudden and total comprehension that the borders were invented and the ball of light was real, and it was small, and it was precious, and it was the only one. He thought about Jane in that room for 6 days. He thought about what it would feel like to be the only light in a language that runs on light. He took the flashlight. "Show me the pattern," he said. The door sealed behind him, with a sound like a held breath finally released. The room was cold and very quiet. The monitors beeped at intervals that Yolanda had told him to ignore, or rather to listen to as background rather than emergency, steady, not critical, just the hospital's best attempt to track vital signs with equipment designed for a completely different biology. The atmospheric mix was slightly heavier than Earth air, with a sweetness underneath the disinfectant that must be the nitrogen-helium blend, and Daniel breathed it and found it fine, the suit doing what suits do. Jane was on the bed. He had seen the photographs from intake. They did not prepare you. The photographs were clinical, overhead, well lit in the institutional sense, which meant they illuminated everything except what mattered. In person, in the low glow of the quarantine room, with her membrane visible from 2 meters away, and the pale almost nothing of her light still trying, still cycling, once every 5 seconds now, he understood for the first time and completely why Rosa Gutierrez had covered her with silver foil and sat down and started talking. She was not quite like the Veth in the diplomatic photographs. Those Veth were tall, formal, their membranes vivid and contained. They looked like emissaries, which was what they were. Jane looked like what she was, a child, small and cold and very far from anything she knew, lying in the kind of stillness that is not rest. Her head turned when he came in. He stopped 2 meters away, because 2 meters felt like the right distance, the distance that says I see you and I am not going to crowd you, the distance a person stands when they are waiting to be invited closer. She looked at him. Her eyes, which the intake photographs had noted as having no visible iris or pupil, just a flat silver gray, caught the ambient light of the room and held it. He couldn't read an expression. He didn't try. He just held still and let her look. The pulse came, blue-white there and gone. He clicked on Yolanda's flashlight and held it up, not pointed at her, aimed at the ceiling between them, diffuse, spreading the blue-white light into the room like a slow bloom. Nothing happened for 6 seconds. Then her membrane shifted. Not much. Not the vivid dynamic display of a healthy Veth. Something tentative, something that corresponded to no word he had ever learned because no word existed for it yet. A dimmer, slower echo of the light he'd introduced, like a conversation begun in a language you're not sure the other person speaks. There and gone. There and gone. He lowered himself into the chair that someone had placed 2 meters from the bed, Yolanda's doing. He suspected. Yolanda, who had thought about this and prepared for it even though she couldn't be the one to use it. And he sat with the flashlight aimed at the ceiling and said the only true thing he could think of to say. I signed the papers. He said it quietly, conversationally, the way you talk to someone who doesn't share your language but can hear your tone. All 11 pages, including the one about financial liability. That one's going to be interesting, but I've been meaning to do something interesting with my savings account for a couple of years, so. Her membrane pulsed, slow but present. My wife would have come in person, he said. She was better at this than me. She understood how to be with someone without doing anything. I always want to do something. It's a professional hazard. He adjusted the angle of the flashlight slightly more diffuse. She died 2 years ago, pancreatic. We had about 4 months from diagnosis to 4 months. The doctors were good. They were honest, which is the thing people don't always want from doctors, but which I've always thought was more important than comfort. Being honest about what's possible. He paused. Jane's membrane pulsed again, and this time it held a half-second longer, blue shading toward something almost violet at the edge, the way a flame will shift color when it finds more oxygen. I don't know what's possible for you, he said. I want to be honest about that. I have a 26-year-old scientist outside with a flashlight and a textbook, and I have 11 pages of forms that say the hospital will do what it can, and he stopped. He thought about it honestly. I have the fact that you turned your head when I was at the window. You turned your head and you were looking at me, and I didn't know what you were saying, but I knew you were saying something. And I have spent 22 years in the business of hearing things that are said in languages that nobody has bothered to learn. The pulse came again. And again. Not stronger, not faster, but regular 3 seconds, not 5, not 4, 3, something finding a rhythm. You said something when I was at the window, he said. Through the glass. I couldn't hear the sound very well, but I felt it. You can do that again if you want. I'm not going anywhere. She looked at him with the flat silver eyes and the pale membrane cycling its slow 3-second language, and then she made the sound again. It wasn't loud, it didn't need to be. It was the tone from before, low and wavering, the one the body makes when language has no other road to take. But this time there was something differentiated in it, something with structure, the difference between noise and music being not the sounds themselves but the presence of intention. He couldn't parse the intention, but he could hear that it was there. "Yeah," he said, "I'm here." He stayed for 4 hours. He didn't do anything that would be recorded in a medical file as treatment. He sat in the chair with the flashlight aimed at the ceiling and talked, the way Rosa Gutierrez had talked about swim meets and gas prices. Because what Rosa Gutierrez had understood without being told was that the content didn't matter and the presence did, that being with someone was not the same as doing something for them, and was sometimes more necessary. He told Jane about Margaret and about Portugal, the trip they'd never taken. He described the sardine restaurants he'd read about, and the light on the water in the photographs, and Margaret's theory that the proper response to the ocean was to eat something and not try to have any thoughts about it. He talked about his grandmother and the hospital and the nurse who spoke loudly in the wrong language. He talked about the first case he'd ever closed successfully, a 13-year-old named Isaac who had been in the foster system for 9 years and who was now, Daniel had heard through a colleague, a structural engineer in Seattle with 2 kids of his own. He talked about the forms, all 11 pages, and what each one meant, and why the financial guarantor page had felt, when he signed it, like something he'd been waiting to do for 2 years without knowing it. Every 20 minutes or so, Jane's membrane produced something that wasn't a pulse. It was longer, more varied, a sequence with repeating elements. He couldn't decipher it. He listened to it anyway, the way you listen to music in a language you don't speak, catching the shape of it, the emotional weight, understanding without understanding. At hour 2, her temperature stabilized. He didn't know this in the room. He knew it because he saw Yolanda's face through the small observation window in the airlock door, pressed against the glass. And Yolanda's face had done something that wasn't quite crying, but was the facial expression adjacent to crying, the one you make when something has gone the way you feared it wouldn't. At hour 3, the membrane began showing color variants. The blue was still dominant, but at the edges, at the junctions between membrane sections, there were flickers of amber, tentative, present, gone, present again. The language of healthy Veth in Yolanda's textbook described amber as a register associated with acknowledgement, with recognition, with what the translator had, in a note, called reciprocal presence. The thing the Veth felt when they knew that another being knew they were there. Daniel didn't know this in the room either. He found out later, when Yolanda showed him the thermal imaging logs and the spectral analysis and the note in the textbook. Speaking very fast and gesturing at graphs, he only partially understood, trying to explain what had happened in language that his training didn't cover. What he knew in the room at hour 3 was simpler. Jane reached out. Not far, 3 inches 4. Her arm, analogous to an arm, the same general function, the membrane glowing where it faced him, extended across the surface of the bed, not toward him exactly, more in his direction. The gesture of something that does not know the word for stay but is attempting the concept. He didn't move closer. He understood, in the way you understand things that don't have instruction manuals, that this was not a request for proximity but for continuity. She wasn't asking him to come to her. She was asking him to still be there. "Still here," he said, "not going anywhere." The amber flicker ran along the edge of the membrane and held. At hour 4, the door to the quarantine wing opened from the outside. 2 beings stood in the airlock. They were 7 feet tall, and their membranes were vivid and dynamic, blue and amber and a deep copper green, and they had to angle their shoulders to fit through the airlock door. They were accompanied by the xenolinguistic liaison officer from the Veth embassy, a small human man named Brennan who had been in the job for 4 years, and who looked, in this moment, like a man arriving 40 minutes late to something that had already been resolved without him. The Veth diplomat, the senior one, if you could read seniority in membrane color, which Yolanda later said you could, and that this individual was extremely senior, looked at Jane for a very long time. Then it looked at Daniel. Its membrane ran through 3 distinct sequences that Brennan did not translate immediately. He was watching his tablet, scrolling through logs, then looking at the membrane, then looking at his tablet again, cross-referencing something with the expression of a person doing math they were not sure would come out. "It's asking," Brennan said slowly, "about the light." He looked at the flashlight in Daniel's hand. "It says, and I want to be careful here, the register is formal, but also it says, what are you?" Daniel looked at the flashlight. He looked at Jane's membrane, which was running amber at a high rate now, which Brennan would later explain was the equivalent of a child's reaction when a parent walks into a room they had not been sure the parent would enter. "I'm the person who signed the papers," Daniel said. Brennan translated. He was clearly uncertain about several of the membrane registers required, but he tried, and the senior Veth watched him with what Daniel was already learning to recognize as patience. The senior Veth responded. Brennan watched the sequence with very great attention. He translated it in a voice that was professionally level and personally affected. "It says," Brennan said carefully, "that among the Veth, the one who keeps the light for a child who is alone, that role has a name. It's," he paused. "The direct translation would be something like the one who maintains the fire that the child can see from a long way off. But the connotation is," he stopped again. "There isn't really an English equivalent. It's sacredish. Important. It says you have done this thing, and it will be recorded." Daniel looked at Jane. Jane's membrane was running 3 colors now, all of them bright. "Tell it thank you," he said. "Tell it she held on, that part was her. She stayed for 11 more days." The Veth brought equipment he didn't understand and personnel he couldn't communicate with directly, and Yolanda ran herself absolutely ragged acting as bridge between the xenobiological data and the Veth medical team, surviving on the granola bars that Daniel kept finding in his bag and presenting at intervals like talismans. Patricia processed 17 additional forms for the Veth medical team's access and did it without comment, which was a kind of statement. On the 4th day, Jane's membrane reached full-spectrum expression for the first time since intake. Yolanda called it clinically and also began to cry, which she had been doing at intervals since the temperature stabilization, and was no longer trying to hide. Daniel came every day. He didn't stay 4 hours every time. There were other cases. There were always other cases. The work did not pause because one case had resolved toward the good. But he came. He sat in the chair, which had been moved to 1 meter from the bed by someone who did not explain the move. He brought the flashlight even though it was, by the 2nd week, clearly unnecessary because Jane's light was doing its own work now and did not need the supplement. On the 7th day, she said something that Brennan could translate. He had been visiting more often. Brennan, standing in the corner with his tablet and watching the exchanges with the intensity of someone who is documenting something for a reason beyond the professional. On the 7th day, during one of Daniel's visits, Jane's membrane ran a sequence that was longer than the fragments he'd been receiving and learning to sit with, more deliberate, aimed directly at him in the way that language is aimed at a specific listener. Brennan said, "She says," he stopped. He looked at his tablet, he looked at the membrane readout. He said, "She says, did you forget I existed?" Daniel was quiet for a moment. "No," he said, "I didn't forget." Brennan translated. Jane's membrane ran amber, deep and sustained. "She says," Brennan continued, and now his voice was not professionally level at all, "she says that she knew. She says she could tell that you knew she was there from outside the glass. She says that is when she decided." He paused again. "I'm having trouble with this register. It's not a word for chose exactly. It's more like oriented, like the way a plant turns toward light but with intention. She says that is when she oriented toward staying." The room was very quiet. Daniel thought about the overview effect, about the cognitive shift that happens when you are far enough away to see the thing whole, when the distance that should make something smaller instead makes it, irreducibly, insistently, there. He thought about Margaret's reading glasses on the nightstand. He thought about his grandmother and the nurse, and the particular clarity of deciding at 9 years old what the world was for. He thought about 11 pages of forms, and the sound through the glass, and the way a species that runs on light will, when it finds any light at all, turn toward it. "Tell her," he said, "that I'm glad." She left on a Tuesday. The Veth transport arrived in the hospital's emergency bay at 6 a.m., which was earlier than expected, and the medical team and 3 embassy officials and Brennan and Yolanda and Daniel were all there, which was more than expected. Patricia was there too, in a coat over her work clothes because she had come in before her shift, which was something she apparently had feelings about and was not discussing. Jane moved under her own power now. She was not the height of the adult Veth, nowhere close, but she moved with more presence than her size suggested, membrane fully active, colors running in patterns that Brennan narrated quietly for Daniel's benefit as they walked. Curiosity, engagement, something analogous to anticipation. She moved slowly past the humans, and the humans stood slightly too still, the way people stand when something is passing that they have not prepared an appropriate response for. She stopped in front of Daniel. Her membrane ran a sequence that Brennan had told him, on the 6th day, he would recognize when he saw it. He had learned to see the difference between the registers, the way you learn to read the difference between a formal statement and a personal one, between the language of diplomacy and the language of someone telling you something true. This was personal. "She says," Brennan said, "that she has a name for you now. In Veth, a name given it's more formal than in English. It means something like being woven into the record. She says your name in Veth will be the phrase I translated before." He cleared his throat. "The one who maintains the fire that the child can see from a long way off. And she says," he stopped. He looked at his tablet. He looked at Jane's membrane. He was not crying, technically. His eyes were doing something adjacent to crying. "She says, I saw it. I was very far away. I saw your light." Daniel stood with that for a moment. He thought about what Margaret would say, which was probably something undeceived and probably something kind, which was the combination that had made her Margaret. He thought about Isaac, the structural engineer in Seattle with 2 kids. He thought about the empty savings account, and the trip to Portugal they'd never taken, and the flashlight that was now Yolanda's and was going to end up in the xenobiology archives with a note in the field log that said, "Experimental. Effective." He thought about 11 pages. "Tell her," he said, "that it wasn't anything that any person would have." "Mr. Reyes," Brennan said. He was not translating, he was speaking for himself. "Any person did not." Daniel stopped. He looked at Jane, who was looking at him with the flat silver eyes that he had learned over 11 days to read as a kind of total attention, the thing they did when they were listening to everything and not just the words. Her membrane held amber, deep and steady, the color of acknowledgement, the color of recognition, the color that the Veth produced when they knew that another being knew they were there. "Okay," he said. "Tell her I saw her too, from the window. I saw that she was trying. Tell her that was the part that mattered. She kept the light going and I followed it." Brennan translated. Jane's membrane ran through 3 colors in rapid sequence, blue, amber, and then the copper green of the senior diplomat's greeting, which Brennan had told him was something close to what humans meant by the word home. Then she turned and walked toward the transport, and the senior Veth fell into step beside her, and the doors opened, and she was gone. The emergency bay was very quiet. Yolanda was crying with no attempt at professionalism, which Daniel considered appropriate. Patricia was looking at the closed transport door with the expression of someone revising an opinion they'd held for a long time. Brennan was entering notes into his tablet with the focused deliberateness of a person who needs to be doing something with his hands. Daniel stood in the bay for a while after the transport left. The morning was coming in through the bay doors, thin and early, the particular light of a day that has not yet decided what it's going to be. He had 3 cases on his desk. He had forms to file, the follow-up forms, the closure forms, the forms that transformed an event into a record, that took what had happened and made it, in the official sense, real. He thought about the fire, the child far away, the light you keep without knowing who can see it. He thought that Margaret had been right about a lot of things, including the one about paperwork and rituals, and the human need to make the uncertain official. He thought she had maybe been slightly wrong about the God complex, not the diagnosis, but the direction. It wasn't about thinking he could fix things. It was simpler and smaller and harder than that. It was just the refusal, one morning at a time, to look away. He went back inside. He had forms to fill out.